You have reached Deception Detection Radio with Kay from the Deception Detection Network. Please stay on the line while I connect you with the truth. Hey everyone, welcome to Deception Detection. I'm Kay. I pray that you had a blessed week. Tonight's broadcast promises to be an extremely interesting one as author Gary Wayne joins me to discuss his book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Gary's been a lifelong contrarian, never getting caught up with popular belief, but instead searching for the truth. His interests have included biblical prophecy, history, and mythology, and these have taken him on many fascinating journeys that can fall under subcategories of each. I feel very blessed to welcome Gary Wayne to Deception Detection tonight. Welcome, Gary. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion tonight, and I'm certainly hoping that what we talk about will be of interest to your audience, and I think they're going to find that we're going to talk about some things that perhaps they haven't heard about before.
I have that feeling too. Genesis 6 Conspiracy looks absolutely fascinating. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and say the opening prayer, and then we will go ahead and just jump right in. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you very much for bringing us all together and for all your blessings and for blessing us with Gary Wayne tonight, having him on and having him share his word with us, Lord, that opens our eyes more to what you want us to know. Please be in control of tonight's broadcast, Lord, and lead us in the way that you want us to do it. Put your words, make your words our words, and just open those doors for us, Lord, to be able to get your holy word out there and to open the ears of people and open the eyes and let them see and hear the things that they have not seen and heard before that are so important, Lord, to your biblical history and what you have planned for us and where we have came from and what everything, how it just evolved around, Lord, from the beginning, from you. Please bless the listeners. Please put a hedge of protection around all of us so that no evil may enter, may penetrate anything, Lord, that has to do with us and your word. Please bless Gary Wayne as he shares your word with us, Lord. And we thank you again for all your blessings and for bringing us together. In Jesus' holy and mighty name, I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, Gary, this is going to be fascinating, and I would like to just go ahead and hand it over to you and have you start us out.
Well, why don't I just briefly give a quick summary about the book, and then we can go from there. So the Genesis 6 Conspiracy is a 6,000-year connect-the-dots investigation into how the Nephilim came about, their descendants thereafter, the mystical religions that rose around them, and the secret societies that also developed throughout those religions, how they partnered in the antediluvian or the pre-flood world, and how they crossed the flood, how they impacted the early post-diluvian world, our history, and how they're still working today in our contemporary time, and I'll take that forward to even into the end time and deliver possibilities to the bloodlines of the Antichrist.
Oh, fascinating. That's quite a span.
That's why it's a large book. It's about 800 pages with over 100 endnotes in it. But there's 98 chapters, and each chapter is a mini story, so no longer than, the average is about 7 or 8 pages. Some are shorter, some are a touch longer, but they're mini stories that just keep sort of forming and with relationships to all of the other subsequent chapters. So everything that is talked about will keep coming up. And I wrote it in that aspect because it is a large book with an incredible amount of information, and so that people could read it in bite sizes, come back, read a little bit more, come back. And if they had to go back and reread a chapter, if they got into the last half of the book, that they can go back and say, okay, I think I need to go read chapter 4 again because that's really relevant to this chapter. And so I understand it's a large book, but it is filled with information, and it comes at you from the first chapter right to the end. And I virtually know of nobody that's been able to sit down and just read it in 2 or 3 days.
It doesn't sound like one either that's easy to put down once you start to read it.
I've been told that by several people.
What led you to write the Genesis 6 conspiracy?
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a real prophecy buff. And as I was cataloging the Bible and sort of grouping all of these different things about prophecy together, I kept reading about these giants. And so then I started in Genesis, and so I started to catalog that. So when I was ready to start writing, I thought, perhaps I would write my shortest book, and this Nephilim thing just sort of really caught my attention. So, but what turned out as I did the research was it's probably not the shortest book I'll write. It's probably the longest book I'll ever write because the investigation just kept opening up more and more doors, and I was getting more and more connections, more and more things I wanted to put into the book. And, I could still be writing today if I wanted because there's just so much information out there about this. But at some point in time, you have to condense the book down and say, people are going to publish this, and if people are going to read it, it has to be a manageable size. And so once I had shut that down, actually weeded 25% out of the book before I presented it to the publishers for editing.
That's amazing. It seems like it would be difficult to figure out what you need to take out and what you leave in because it sounds like the whole thing is so important.
Exactly, but you have to sort of distinguish between what really interests me and what's really important to the story of the book, and hopefully I did that. Although I do know some people might say, well, maybe you could have weeded it down a little bit more, but really, if you read every chapter, there are no weak chapters in there. Every chapter is relevant, and every page is relevant and loaded with information.
That's wonderful. Now, in discussing the Genesis 6 conspiracy, where would you like to start at the very beginning with it? I mean, I know that there are a lot of people, just like I'd said to you before we even got on the broadcast, the the Nephilim, the giants, they're not something that we're taught in church.
No, I've never heard of it talked about in church. I've heard some sort of out there religions that are not mainstream Christianity. They seem to talk about it, but somewhere after the 15th or 16th century, it became one of those topics that the churches just seem to avoid. And I guess maybe it's politically incorrect these days and in the past, or it just seems too fantastic. And they probably haven't researched, most of the ministers haven't researched and know the complete story. So it's probably not something that they want to touch on. So yeah, let's start at the beginning. And so if you go into Genesis 6, that's the beginning of the flood story. And the Nephilim are talked about as being created when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and created great heroes and men of renown, and they were known as the Nephilim. So now some people confuse Nephilim and Gibberim, two terms if you're really into the genre that people do debate over. And so heroes of old and men of renown is the Gibberim term, but the Nephilim is a separate term meaning fallen ones, and they were the son of the fallen angels. And so these angels came about these went and produced these Nephilim in about the 6th generation, or the generation of Jared in the Seth lineage. Fairly large period of time before the Nephilim came along, and then by the 10th generation we have the flood. It's in with the flood. The Nephilim story is in with the flood because it's directly connected to the flood and one of the source causes of the flood. But we're not given a lot of information. In fact, without being too bold, the information is very, very stingy. And for some, they'll overlook the subject because of that. For me, it was more, I need to find out more about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we look at the Nephilim being created in the sixth generation, then what happened before that? Well, that's when we need to take in the Cain genealogy. And the genealogies of Cain and Enoch and Seth are so very, very, very important because there's two competing bloodlines descending from Adam that are at play here. And of course, I had referred to the mystical religions and the rise of secret societies. Now, they partnered with the Nephilim and were part of the creation with the fallen angels as their backers in the sixth generation. So, as it goes, and this you won't find this in the Bible, but certainly in Freemasonry, they talk about the seven sacred sciences. And so, Freemasonry has so many legends, and I'll utilize a lot of their legends and not only legends from Freemasonry, but whether it's other religions and other mythologies. I want to underline this point just so that your readers understand it's only for context, and I'm only using things that will bring out the story of Genesis and further on. So nobody has to worry about what I'm going to talk about from Freemasonry. But what Freemasonry does record is their version of prehistory. And they're a Masonic organization that was created in prehistory, and they were created through this information that was first taught to Adam in Eden, as they believe. And so whether or not that came from God, came from elsewhere, there was an incredible amount of information, and these became known as the seven sacred sciences. And they were passed on to both Cain and to Abel, but Abel, of course, was killed by Cain, and then later it was passed on to Seth. So this information was now in the hands of two different lineages and two different types of people. And so the Sethians were known as agrarians, and if you go right into the creation of Adam, it's talking about an agrarian society, a farming, ranching society. And so astronomy is what they developed because they needed that for understanding the seasons and planting crops and everything that they needed to do to have an agrarian society. And so they were probably experts in these fields, but they became known in many writings for the astronomy aspect. But the other lineage of Cain, they developed this knowledge in a completely different manner. And so firstborn of Cain is also Enoch, not to be confused with the Enoch of the Seth lineage, who comes a few generations later.
Mm-hmm.
And so Cain and Enoch are credited in Freemasonry legends for developing the sciences to an incredible level, that they had the ability to create sciences and technology and a civilization and build the monuments around the world that people are still mystified today and wonder how they were done and when they were done. According to Freemasonry, they did it. The lineage of Cain through Enoch. And when they decided to pervert these sciences and use them not to honor the true God of the universe, they created mystical religions centered around the fallen angels that were assisting them. And the fallen angels would have also given them other significant illicit information that is, again, chronicled in like the books of Enoch and other sources that are not in the Bible. Over time, history and secret societies and the mystical religions have woven them into one to give their beginnings and their religions and their organizations this veil of legitimacy, and probably also in the last 2,000 years to protect themselves from the wrath of the Roman Church.
Oh.
And so when they started to develop these seven sciences, they developed the mystical religion to incorporate them in. And that's where the secret societies and initiation and the sun-worshipping religion developed from. And so Enoch, son of Cain, developed a sun-worshipping, polytheist, pagan religion that honored Satan and the fallen angels and created the pantheon from those fallen angels, and then created secret societies for the rich, the powerful, and the militaristic, where they initiated them into to keep the secrets of what they were developing, because even though they were given the sciences and the information, they had to develop. And what they developed, they wanted kept from the Seth line and from the mundane humans, as they would refer to us as. By the sixth generation, evil on the Cain side was multiplying. And so it's the daughters of Cain, and with this belief system that partners with the fallen angels, with their daughters, to create the Nephilim. And then they bring the Nephilim in as the kings and the rulers of the world. And so now you have this marriage of government and military and mystical religion that now starts to dominate the world. And of course, by Noah's generation, the world is filled with violence and corruption, almost to the point where it makes God cry. And people kind of wonder, like, how could it get so bad? And so when you understand what was going on in the antediluvian world, you know that you'll begin to understand why the flood was necessary and a restart was required. But what's interesting in Genesis 6 as well is that it says the Nephilim were both before and after the flood.
Yes.
And so I'll document in my book how that's possible, both scripturally and what it says in legends and things around the world, and give people options as to how that happened, and also a possibility that there was another second impassioned violation against the laws of creation perhaps afterwards. And it could be both, but it just seems to me from nations that are documented in the Bible and Nephilim nations documented in the Bible that it's most likely that these nations, these peoples, both giant and otherwise, survived the flood somehow.
That's a very big question that a lot of people have. That's one that I've had myself. And while we're talking about this time period, it's something that I'd mentioned to you before we went on the air, but it's something that I think that the listeners would be interested in. I was asking you if the fallen angels were able to change the way that they look to make themselves appear more handsome and desirable to the women instead of how they actually were. And I wanted to ask you also about the seraphim, if you could, please.
Yeah, so I think that's a very, very good question, because once I describe what the Nephilim looked like and what the seraphims looked like, a changeling quality probably took place so that they would be enticing to the females. And so if we look at the fallen angels, in some documents and mythologies and religions, they were known as the Watchers, and they were a special order of watchers. And these watchers were the ones that reigned and governed over the earth and were the emissaries between heaven and earth. Now, these watchers, they were part of the rebelling against God as well. And so the rebellion of the fallen angels is also part of the book, and I'll cover that off in the first section of the book as well, and how that relates. But understand that these were seraphim angels. Now, the word seraphim is not in the Bible, but the word seraph is. And in the book of Isaiah, it refers to them as vipers. And I'll present, or vipers or snakes, and I'll present several descriptions of why the seraphims were snake-like. And I think if you look at the snake statues and the dragons and all of the stuff that permeates prehistory within the kings and the gods, there's a very good case that they actually did look like snakes. And so if you look at the face of the seraphim in one of its forms, it was a snake with wings, which is actually one of the forms of dragons. Yes. And so dragons I'll talk about a lot in the book as well, and the dragon bloodline. Now, the Nephilim looked just like them.
Oh.
And so you had these monstrous beasts that had the face of snakes. and they had long necks. And I'll cover all of this off in the book and give the descriptions. And they weren't just 8 feet tall in the smallest rendition of Goliath. And I'll also connect Goliath to being Nephilim as well. And that'll become evident when I get into that aspect of the book and trace that back.
Okay.
Some of these giants, depending on how you measure L's in Enoch, and I'm not a fan of the outlandish one measurements, but some of them have them as the original giants as about 200 feet high. I think the general consensus is somewhere between 20 and 40 feet from about most people in the first generation. There's a few people that say maybe 16 to 20, but understand no matter whether they were 16 feet tall in the first generation or 20 feet tall or 25 feet tall, they were monstrous. And they had shoulders that were very, very wide, and they were built like what we would call today like a WWF wrestler or a lineman in football. They weren't tall and gangly. They were muscular and large. And so they had their shoulders were a full third wider than the average human. And their eyes glowed, and they were known as the shining ones. They didn't shine as much as the seraphim angels because they were considered opalescent beings of a shining and translucent in their spiritual form. But these eyes glowed, and they had these slanted snake-like eyes. And so these were very, very, very dreadful beasts. And even their voices bellowed, and in the Greek mythologies, you'll hear the term, Atlas bellowed like out of the caves of the mountains, and so their voices would be trembling. So they were fearful to look at. And so if you can imagine this sort of snake-like being that's probably larger than a human being, and I'm talking about the seraphim angels now, going to the daughters, the females of Cain at that time, that would be either a very frightening event or they had a changeling quality. And in other religions like the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, the Essene tradition, Gnostic tradition, in mythologies around the world is these gods had the ability to change. They would change any form that they want, and they could also choose their gender in the physical world. And so when we look at the lower gods of the pantheon, where we see that coming out in pagan religions, is that they have lower gods. And so it's very possible then that they also procreated within themselves, within the physical world here, and created a lower level of God, as well as a hybrid being that was created with human beings.
That's fascinating. I've never heard that before.
And so people say, well, where's that in the Bible? Well, I can give you two accounts where there's a changeling thing that is going on that maybe people can look to, and there are a few more, but I'll stick with a couple. So the first time we're encountered with, and it's not called a changeling encounter, but you get it from just reading it. So when we're in Eden at the fall, and Satan deceives first Eve, and then Adam is deceived as well, he changes into a snake.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so there's a changeling quality there, because it didn't say Satan went as a cherubim or a seraphim image. It was a snake in Eden that had deceived him. Now the snake at that time walked on 2 feet and was taller than a human being and was an intelligent human being, and some of them had hands and some of them had wings, and that's where the wings are more of the physical dragon aspect out of prehistory that follows through into our world today in so many writings. And the second example I'll give you from a changeling quality is at Sodom and Gomorrah. And interestingly enough, in the book, I'll talk about Sodom and Gomorrah as a possible location for the second impassioned account where Nephilim were created by fallen angels, and as well bring in the Nephilim as one of the key ingredients to the, not the key ingredient, but one of the key reasons why Sodom was destroyed, because Nephilim were all about, and I'll talk about that in the book as well. in the Sodom and Gomorrah account, 3 males show up and visit with Abraham, and they talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. Clearly, these are human beings and how they look there. They clearly don't have wings, and they don't have this opalescent sort of translucent quality about it. They are taken as human beings, and to me that translates as a changeling quality, just as several other angelic encounters throughout the Old Testament where they're not looked at as angels with wings, but as human beings.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I don't think most people really think about it in sort of that sort of depth, and that's probably why, one of the reasons why I call myself a contrarian is I read things in Scripture and I'm going, okay, well, how does that happen? So I need to learn about that.
I like that. I mean, you're saying a lot right now you're kind of leaving me speechless at points because it's things that I had not even entertained in my own mind before.
Well, and that's one of the interesting journeys on the book is not only will you learn about what the other side says, because I let them speak for themselves, and that they're telling the same story right through to the end time. So not only are they going to learn aspects about all of these other different sources, they're going to learn things in the Bible that they hadn't thought about or didn't realize was there. And so there's this continual sort of revelation and taking on those subject matters that people tend to ignore. So I think for a Christian, they're going to learn a lot about the Bible in areas that they hadn't thought about. And when I get into after the flood and we start talking about the Exodus and we start talking about Babel and Nimrod and the conquest of the Promised Land and the David and King Saul monarchy, I'm going to talk about things in ways that people hadn't thought about before, but it makes sense. And the information is all there in the Bible, and then I'll give additional information to give more context from outside the Bible.
Wonderful. Everyone, you may want to get a piece of paper and a pen handy so that you can write some of these things down. And I'm going to give it back over to you, Gary.
Okay, so we're talking about the prehistory world, and so I've already noted that they were the cause of the first apocalypse. And so now I'm going to take this story forward, and we're going to talk about, just as our Messiah, our Redeemer, Jesus said, the end days will be just like the days of Noah. We need to take that seriously.
Yes, we
And
do.
and if that is the case, then we ought to see similar things that happened in the antediluvian world, like the mystical religions, the sciences, the violence, the wars, and somehow the Nephilim. And so if that's the case, how does that happen? When I get into section 3, I'll talk about how these Nephilim either survived the flood or there was another creation or both that started this whole thing again after the flood. So this time, though, they didn't create the same sort of havoc that they did before the flood, and that's why the Babel incident is so important. So if you understand the Babel incident, there's one character that's generally not related to Babel very often, and that's Nimrod. And then there's what happened at the Tower of Babel. And so this was the first Masonic manifestation of the seven sciences again. The descendants of Enoch, the evil, the sons of Lamech, the evil, because there's a Lamech on the Seth side as well. There were 4 of them, and they developed these sciences to an astronomical level, so to speak, and they realized that the flood was coming. There was nothing that they could do, and so they stored all of the information that Enoch had developed, and there was an incredible amount of books. And one of the sources I came across was 36,525 books, which is also a solar year, which is, again, sort of an allegory of their sun-worshipping mystical religion. We stored these in 9 vaults. and because that's a solar year, the 365.25 days.
Right.
The sons of Lamech and one daughter, Nama, who is also a very interesting individual, they created two pillars that was designed to store the information, what the seven sciences were, and where that information was stored. And I'm going to back that up in terms of what the relationship to the Masonic Society, that if you look at Tubal-Cain, Nama, Jubal, and Jabal from the Cain line, they're noted in the Bible. Tubal-Cain is as forged tools, bronze and iron. It's interesting that Masonry in their legends, and even today, they honor Tubal-Cain as a smith and an artificer, and he was the first to create weapons and tools and became known as the master craftsman, and he is one of their great patriarchs. Nama is known not for anything in the Bible that she did, except that in other sources she actually married and produced some giants. So she would have married either other Nephilim or one of the fallen angels. But she's known in the craft as for weaving, and Jabal was developing the musical side of the seven sciences, and Jabal, very interesting, was known for developing masonry. And in the Bible, Jubal is known for music, and Jabal was known as living in tents and ranching. So those four names are in the Bible for a reason, not for those innocuous accounts, but for the notorious things that they did in the antediluvian world, and then what they did to help spoil the post-diluvian world. And so there's an individual that comes along that's not in the Bible, and he's not in the Table of Nations, but everybody will know his name. And he is a patriarch of mysticism, of alchemy, and alchemy is one of the outcomes of the seven sciences through the fifth science of masonry and geometry. Mm-hmm. Just as philosophy is the great tool of the secular society, and that's a combination of three of the other sciences, and philosophy is the great sort of concept in the religion that permits the ability to have discipline over the knowledge, so that reason can dictate and control the information, and reason is more important than faith. So even in that, you see a diametrically opposed view of the world as the faith in God, that and to everything as being as reason.
Yeah, very much.
And so Babel was the tower that was built, and Hermes is the one who found these pillars and then accessed the information of the seven sciences and started to redevelop them with Nimrod. And again, when I get into the Babel accounts, I'll talk about the relationship of Nimrod with Nephilim, although I'll make the argument that he is not Nephilim because Nimrod is in the Table of Nations in both First Chronicles and in Genesis. And none of the Nephilim names or none of the Nephilim nations are in the Table of Nations. And consequently, Nimrod's descendants are not in the Table of Nations. And so I take from that, because I ask these why questions, because it's only tabling the descendants of Noah after the flood and the righteous descendants for the most part. And so if Nimrod's descendants weren't recorded, he probably produced Nephilim. And the only one that's in the Table of Nations that would be sort of traced whatsoever would be the descendants of Esau. And that's for a reason to explain where these people came from. Where did Seir came from? Where did these people that lived, the Horites, in that area come from? Because they're not in the Table of Nations, but he married into them and they formed the lords of Edom and then later the Amalekites. And then I'll talk more about the Amalekites were likely an antediluvian nation as well. But we're on Babel and Nimrod right now. Nimrod essentially became an antichrist figure. And he had complete sway over the world that we know of from a Christian perspective and a Jewish perspective of the descendants of Noah. So he had total control. He had the mystical religion. He had the power, and the Nephilim were there. So we have a similar scenario that's going to happen in the end time. And so it's important for people to learn about Babel. And we understand how powerful these seven sciences is that they were developing, and how strong the ability to build was just by building the tower. But then there's this odd comment in the Babel narrative that if working as one people, and I'm going to paraphrase this,
Okay.
working as one people with one language, there's nothing that they will not be able to do. That, to me, is a reference to these sciences. And then we have Babel Gate, that I like to call it, because that's when the languages are imposed on people and they're dispersed around the world.
That's a good name for it.
Yeah,
I like
and
that.
and I also like it because a couple other aspects that I'll talk about at Babel. One is there's two translations. There's a Mesopotamian translation, which is actually Akkadian, as I recall, and a Hebrew translation. And Babel is translated in the Hebrew language as confusing of languages, but in the Akkadian language, it's Gateway of the Gods.
Really?
Yes, and I'll show that in the book as well. So one wonders that if they're building this pyramid, this ziggurat, and they had these pyramids in the antediluvian world, and if people are familiar where in other accounts, and particularly in the book of Enoch, that these 200 seraphim angels descended down to Mount Hermon to procreate the Nephilim, was this another attempt to bring the fallen angels back and recreate Nephilim again? It's also a possibility, and I'll talk, get into in different aspects of the book, that there are portals to the other world and other dimensions that could be another possibility here. But understand that Babel Gate and Babel in itself is filled with information if people just want to research the name. And of course, in the end time, we end up with the Babylonian religion. I think people, in my opinion, really need to go back and learn about Babel.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Gary, with the sciences, the seven sciences, and everything, their abilities that they had with those, did any of those involve magic? Was there a magic tone to them?
Oh, absolutely. And, including, if you want to call alchemy part of the magic. Magic is key in their belief system, and it comes from the word magi.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so just let me give you a little bit of history on this, and I'm really going to bring it back.
Okay.
So if you look at after Babel, because of the dispersion of the people, and that was how God made sure that there would be enough time for our 6,000 years or our time allotment to fully take place. There are two legs that now sort of spring up as sort of the cradle of development of these religions and these sciences. Hermes goes to Egypt and develops the Egyptian religion, which is why Freemasonry is basically an Egyptian religion, and that's the one they model themselves on.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, Nimrod goes to Akkad, and restarts that civilization and develops with the Chaldeans these sciences, which were the wise men, which were also known as the Magi.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so you now have two parallel religions and dynasties being started, and by this time, Nimrod's already married into the Nephilim and is having his own descendants, and they'll start to interbreed with the Egyptian dynasty as well. And at that time, there will be several large Nephilim-dominated kingships, and because the Nephilim usurped the kingship again in the early post-Diluvian world. So you've got the Chaldeans and the Mesopotamians, and you've got the Amalekites, and you've got the Egyptians, and you've got the Mitanni dynasty, and you've got the Hittite dynasty. This was, at least in the Middle East perspective, the start all over of these kingships that ruled the known world, and their bloodlines continue to this day. Now, back to the Magi. So if you look at Atlantis as one of an alternative example of prehistory recorded in Greek mythology, they have these wizards. And they develop the sciences, and so you've got these wizards that pop up all throughout history as we look at in other civilizations. So you see, let's say, the Egyptian dynasty, you've got the priesthood, and they're always right at the right-hand side and almost as powerful as Pharaoh or another king, let's say, in another dynasty. And so they worked in partnership, and this comes from the antediluvian structure. And so the descendants of Cain were the priests and the wizards that you see in Atlantean mythology with the big hats and the wands and Harry Potter. This is all part of that imagery that they keep alive today. If we look at how some of this comes forward with the magic, what they basically did, because they kept the knowledge in secret societies, what they were able to do looked like magic, but it all stemmed from the secret societies and the knowledge that they learned. And when we look at the imagery of these wizards, if you look at the movie in Lord of the Rings, and the Lord of the Rings is also another allegory and a story about the Nephilim kingships in the antediluvian world, what do we have? We have these wizards again. King Arthur tales and the Holy Grail tales, which again is all part of this mix and this recording of genealogies and the history with encoded messages for those who are quote-unquote illuminated. They understand, and the rest is just interesting stories for the mundane, as they call them. You have Merlin, and Merlin is an exact representation of an Atlantean wizard. This is not coincidence. This is all evidence of a mythos, and a mythos, as opposed to mythology, is an ever-living mythology, something that is perpetual and in every generation. And it's kept alive, and it's kept alive by these organizations and these mystical religions and these secret societies and the powerful families that still work with them.
Amazing. And they don't get changed much.
No, they don't. They don't. They're just keeping it more alive and relevant for the generation that they're in. And what people don't realize is that let's take the King Arthur tales. They have names in those tales that go directly back to Nephilim. And Bron and Bran would be a classic example, and that comes from Hebron. And Hebron was the capital of the Anak at the time of not only the Israelites during the Exodus, but all the way back probably as far as Abraham and before. One of the interesting other alternative names for Hebron is Kiriath Arba, and Arba is the father of the Anak. And so if you go back into what Hebron used to be called before, was changed to Hebron, it was Kiriath Arba. And they'll put in these types of names as sort of an allegory leading them back to giants. There's a code in there and there's a genealogy in there, just as the land name pops up over and over and over and over and over in various different forms. And that's another sort of bloodline that goes back to the Scythians and the bloodlines from that area. And I'll cover off those as well. But in the book, the Scythians are one of the key original tribes that the descendants of Japheth married into very early on in the post-Diluvian world.
That's a lot of information.
And it's one of the reasons why I take time throughout the book to lay down the foundations and bring it out slowly, because what I'm talking about, if somebody's listening, there's a ton of holes in here, right? Because I'm kind of moving around a little bit. I'll connect them all, and you'll see the direct connections all the way through.
But you've got to lay out that plan, and then you've got to tie it together so that it all makes sense.
Absolutely. And that's also why utilizing Scripture as the measuring stick and all the other information that's out there for context is so very important, so that you get a better, more colorful picture.
Mm-hmm.
But everything I'm going to talk about that is in the book from the other side, so to speak. I'll have references and say this is where the Bible is talking about that. You just need to understand that they're talking about the same thing.
Now, where does Semiramis fit in with Nimrod and all of this?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Semiramis. Maybe I know him by a different name.
Semiramis was Nimrod's mother.
Right, okay. Well, I think Semiramis would have been not really, Well, let me back that up because what you're referring to is the mother goddess, and
Yes.
so she became within the mythology a personification of the female goddess, and so the mortals or the humans, they will take on those sort of appellations, but she was not the mother goddess. Just as they made Eve in mythology a mother goddess, but she wasn't the mother goddess. So you have to understand that these goddesses were actual fallen angels, and they created a sort of the dual aspect of the religion, and they were powerful, and they have bloodlines as well. And within this whole sort of mythology, mystical religion, and bloodlines, understand there are female bloodline of Nephilim and a male bloodline, and so there's a patriarch bloodline and a matriarch bloodline, and both are important. And so when we get into the origination of some of these names, you're going to hear names like Tiamat that people might be familiar with, or Lilith.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, these are the mother goddesses. Also, you'll know Inanna, Isis, and several other ones, Gaia. These are all the same god. And pantheons around the world are the same pantheon. In the lower level, they may have some other lower level gods that are a little bit different, but the structure is essentially the same. And so if you have a god, say Zeus or Enki, they are equivalent. Some people will say Zeus is equivalent with Anu. I'm not going to quibble. If you go to the Egyptian pantheon, it's Osiris, and so and it's Isis and Osiris. And another equivalent one within Mesopotamia would be Tammuz, who is in the Bible, and that's who the Essenes were worshiping to in Ezekiel, that Ezekiel took such exception to. And the Essenes are another group that I'm going to talk about, but those are the Essenes because they were praying to the east. And again, we're talking about this sun-worshipping religion, and I'll connect the Essenes in the last 2,000 years of the conspiracy because they bring in a whole different look to the conspiracy, and they are kind of the crossroads in the modern organized part of the conspiracy. But that might be a topic for down the road. But my point is that if you understand that these religions were exported through Egypt and through Nimrod's empires and cities to pretty much all of the world, you'll understand why the pantheon structures are the same. You have to understand that there's essentially two religions, monotheism and polytheism. And I'm not trying to offend Christians that if they don't believe Islam is a true religion or not like that. All I'm saying is they believe in one God, and they believe the God is the same God as our God. It's monotheism, as opposed to believing in many gods, which is the religion of the fallen angel and of Satan. And so you have these two opposing forces that are at work. And if we understand that everything that the other side talks about in all the other different mythologies is talking about the same religion and the same story from the same belief system, everything starts to make sense. Because we have giants told in cultures and religions and mythologies around the world in all of the continents, and they're all related to the flood. And they all have stories about giants surviving the flood as well as humans.
Yes, they do.
And if you look at that and say, okay, let's just move that away from mythology, because most of those mythologies were the religions, right? This is a mythology of their religion. So it's really their religion. If you get into the Vedas, they tell the same story. It's the same type of mythology, but it is their religion. And if we look at some of the stories that are told about people surviving the flood, that's used by our secular society and all who want to do us harm as mocking the legitimacy of the Genesis story as not being original. Let's take the most popular one. Let's talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh just for a second.
Okay.
And everybody says that, not everybody, but seculars will say that all the Jewish people did was copy that story and changed it a little bit. And if you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh at the macro level, it's a very similar story. But of course, and I like this pun, the devil is always in the details.
That's right.
And so once you get into the details of the Gilgamesh epic, you understand this is not the Noah account. So If we talk about Gilgamesh, for example, and I'll actually connect him back through Enoch as being a giant from the antediluvian world because his name is mentioned, and he is known in this legend to have survived the flood on an ark. Gilgamesh is one half human and one half god. He is a demigod born from the gods. He is Nephilim. And the story that Gilgamesh recants these epics to is somebody called Enkidu, who was created after the flood, as it seems in this account, so possible second impassioned violation against the laws of creation. And he's created to counterbalance Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh is an absolute evil tyrant, and he's there for a balance. Gilgamesh to protect the people, because he's just this evil tyrant, as all Nephilim were.
Mm-hmm.
But they become really good friends. But Enkidu is created as a Nephilim, and he is a demigod. So now we have two Nephilim, and this is just in the preamble. And now we get to the hero of the flood, and he's known as Upnapishtim or Ziusudra, depending on which language it's being translated from. And this fellow was a king, was a Nephilim king at the time of the flood. And he too is a demigod, and the archetypical Nephilim.
Wow.
So all of a sudden here, we're not talking about a story of human survival. They're either copying the Genesis account of the human survival, or this is their own account from their own religion, from their own perspective of their kingship's survival.
That would make sense, that if they had no other explanation, that they would make up their own to make them look better.
Yep. So it's one of two possibilities. They either copied it and it's just an older existing account, or it's an account of how Nephilim actually crossed the flood. And of course, we do know that the Bible says in Genesis 6 that Nephilim were both before and after the flood. So it's possible. Now, if we look at the Greek mythology, and they also have a flood account, of course, they all land on a mountain, just like the Noah account. And there are two individuals in this account as well. They are also descendants of one, the male is a descendant of Prometheus. And Prometheus is both a Nephilim in the Greek mythology, or a Titan, and a god. So he's a Nephilim. And his wife, Noria, is, I should mention the name, Deucalion is the name in the Greek mythology, just for people who want to check me on this. His wife is Noria, and also has a couple other names, but she has like 8 or 10 different names, and one of them is Nama. And I don't find that to be a coincidence. And the Gnostics believe that this is the Nama from the Cain lineage, the daughter of Lamech.
Oh, so they're tying it together?
They're tying it together, and I'll document that in the book as well. And so we have another Titan sort of story of how they survived on the flood. Plus, we also have Tartarus, where in the Greek rebellion of Titans, that the conquered Titans were imprisoned into Tartarus, which is another word for otherworld. And some people will translate that as abyss, but there's an argument that one translation as the abyss is misused or has an alternative translation. So we're talking about a different location, in my opinion. And it's possible that they escaped from Tartarus after the flood and into Scythia, which I mentioned earlier.
Now, the abyss, would that be the one that's spoken of in the Bible? That is, yes. Okay.
So the abyss is the prison where the fallen angels of the antediluvian epoch were locked away into for their sins against creation. And so they will be released in the end time. So the havoc again, because when we look at the keys of the abyss being released in Revelation, and we see these really ugly looking creatures coming out, these are what they look like to John, I guess, at the time in the vision, but they are indeed the fallen angels, and there could be some demons in there too. And so all of the havoc that they created in the pre-flood world, they're going to create in the end time, because it makes sense, because it's going to be like the days of Noah.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to look to see that.
Do you think that they will be in the giant form, or that it'll be more of a mutation in the DNA?
Well, there's several different ways that you could produce the Nephilim in the end time, depending on how much time that the fallen angels are released before we get into the last 7 years. So unless these Nephilim can grow up instantly, there's going to be need to be a certain amount of time beforehand that they would once more procreate with human females to produce giants. We also have the possibility that humankind, with the new man concept, which is all part of this belief system. So anytime you hear the new man concept, whether it's with the Nazis or genetics or eugenics or anything that's going on, this is the same concept to create another Nephilim. But with DNA manipulation, as opposed to eugenics, there's a possibility that humankind can create their own superhuman. And that would live longer, maybe be smarter, be bigger, stronger, whatever. Which again is all sort of part of this new transhumanism thing that's going on today. Another aspect which I'll touch on lightly in my book is the possibility that hybrids could come about from aliens, and I'll connect aliens into this sort of whole mix as well. And so that the technology that the aliens are providing and the experimenting that they're providing in this mythos could be another possibility, because I think there's a good possibility that whether a hoax or not, this whole delusion is going to be part of the end time that is going to come full about. I'll talk a little bit about that, but the reference for that might come for when you're looking at the Antichrist and thrown into heaven and bring some of the heavenly hosts here. So I think it's kind of describing possibly some sort of either angelic sort of war, or will look more like an alien type war, right? So we're going to be part of the delusion, I think, is what they're going to do is say, hey, we're part of this galactic universe with many, many different species, and we're all fighting for our freedom. And if you want to be part of it, you're going to have to rebel and join us.
Now, do you believe that they would be actually what they say they are, interplanetary, or do you believe that they could be? I tend to believe more towards the interdimensional line.
More likely interdimensional, yes. Whether or not whether or not that's the story they tell us, I think it's a more plausible belief that if you look, and let's look to some of the propaganda. So let's go to science fiction. And in science fiction, we have one world that's come together, right? Either through war or through the full exposure of we're not alone in the universe. And we sit at this table of galactic species, right?
Right.
Like the Babylon 5 series that people might remember from the 90s. It doesn't matter whether it's that or Star Trek or it's Star Wars. This is the imagery that they're preparing us for. So if you understand that science fiction has the mystical religion all throughout, and they've got it laced in so many cases with allegories from prehistory, it's not a tough leap of faith to suggest that this is their propaganda preparing us with all these other things that are going on there, that, UFO sightings, in preparation to delude us in the end time to rebel against God.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
And if you look at it from their religion, from their mystical religion, you need to understand a few things. Maybe not you, but certainly many of the audience, is that they are very much a dualistic religion, good against evil, and dualistic in terms of male and female. So they believe their God is actually equal to our God. And their God, Lucifer, or Satan, is the one that monotheist religions all throughout history have maligned and slandered and has been taught as evil. But what they believe is Lucifer is not evil. Lucifer is this great God who delivers information and knowledge and is an angel of light. Remember that Satan masquerades as an angel of life from the Bible, if people want to check that reference out.
That's very true.
And that he is an emancipator who is fighting for the freedom of humans against the evil God, as they look at it, the oppressor, the one who brings on horrible events like the flood and so many other things that they like to cite. And so they actually believe that they're equal, and they actually believe that their God and their rebellion, that's what they teach in these religions, I think the fallen angels know otherwise, that they actually can win this war. That's what they teach. And so the followers believe they are the disciples of light. that they are the sons of light, and that's why they use all these light allegories in these secret societies and in these religions.
Mm-hmm.
All of this has meaning. And so if we understand that they believe they're the good guys and we're the bad guys, you can start to see how people can be deluded.
Very easily, because people want to do good, and they're being told different sides of the story, and they're being switched. And the Satan is the author of chaos, and that's what he's counting on right now.
Absolutely. And if you go back to the first three of the sacred sciences that I talked about, there's grammar, and there's rhetoric, and there's dialectics. And they all form philosophy. And let me connect this to what I'm saying. And so the initial for grammar in its ancient sort of meaning was the molding of minds through reading. So they want to teach people to read and write, and they want them to learn more. And rhetoric is the art of persuasion. Dialectics is discerning truth and falsehoods. And so they can turn this one really inside out, and they create that through this critical thought as part of philosophy. And this is continually taught to our people, to our children, to the students in schools. And so their minds are being prepared in a slanted and biased way to critically analyze Christianity in a way that it is not to be done, and that the outcome has to be like that is either an obsolete fairy tale religion or an evil religion. And you have to understand that these sciences are at work today. And if people don't realize that is the case, there's an organization in Rome that's called the Royal Society that all education pays homage to. And it's also known in the mystical societies as the Invisible College. And so this society was created in about the 1600s. And it remains today in London. And it was created by the Rosicrucians in Freemasonries to develop the seven sacred sciences to honor the great architect of the universe, as they call Lucifer, and to expand the knowledge and to utilize these organizations to brainwash society against Christianity.
Now, I've even seen commercials that said, mold your child's mind by reading.
Mm-hmm. These are all their dogmas. And I'll connect the Rosicrucians and all these societies all the way back to the original mysticism in the pre-flood era and to the Egyptian and Chaldean religions as the same religion and the same belief system, and show how they continue what they started back then. They will not stop until they bring about the end time.
Amazing. And right now, with the way things are looking, we are going into, or we are in, I believe anyway, the end times.
We are certainly looking very closely. If it's not here, it's got to be within reaching distance. There's just so many things that are lining up. There's still some major stumbling blocks come about, but things can change quickly. But typically, from a geopolitical scenario, we're pretty much there. We have pretty much all of the nations that need to be in place, and particularly for the Magog War. And Persia is rising, and Iran will have complete control over Iraq and complete that. Soviet Union fell, and now it's just Russia, which has to be. And I think Hal Lindsey was bang on that in the 80s, and he stuck with it that it wasn't going to be the Soviet Union that was going to be Gog. But as it turns out, I think he came correct on that. But if you look around the world, we have the correct geopolitical scenario that just needs some cataclysms to stitch it together. And we have the technology in place. We have Christianity on the run in so many places, and we have the rise of these mystical religions in all aspects of our lives. And I think we're getting very, very close to the end times. The only real main factors from putting us right in it is that we don't have world government yet, but I'll cover off how in my book how that's going to come about, and that they believe that they're going to succeed. And obviously from the Bible, we know they will succeed, and how they're going to bring about the one world religion and what that religion will look like, because it is the Babylon religion. It is the religion of Enoch the Evil, and what they're doing to bring that about. And so those are the two big stumbling blocks. And I'll cover off in the book how those are likely to come about. One of the interesting things about when we talk about world government, we don't talk now if it's going to happen. It's just how far off in the future it is. It's becoming this sort of accepted ideal. Many people don't want it to happen, but many people accept that it's probably going to happen. And so if we look into Daniel and we look into Revelation, there's going to be 10 kingdoms with 10 empires.
Yes.
One of the interesting parallels out of prehistory is Atlantis. And you have to understand that these societies and religions, they want to create the new Atlantis, or their new 1,000-year reign, their new age of Aquarius. Atlantis was made up of 10 empires. They want to create the new Atlantis at 10, and Atlantis was known in their mythologies as the helm of world government. Now, if we look at how 10 empires would come together in today's world, the people used to think, well, it's going to be maybe, the United countries of Europe, and there's going to be 10 nations that do this. Well, that's not how it's going to come about. It's going to come about through 10 blocks of nations, or 10 trade blocks, or 10 economic zones, or 10 spheres of influence, probably a mixture of all of it. And so if you look at the NAFTA Accords, you look at Mexico, Canada, and the US, that would be one of those empires. In the European community, that's going to split into two, in my opinion. So there'll be two of the empires, and Russia is going to have another empire. China's going to dominate another one. There's going to be a Pac Rim one. You can see these empires forming. You don't have to be a prophet to look out and see that South America and Central America are forming together into a trade bloc, or that the African nations, or the African Union, as they're starting to call them, is starting to rise. It's going to be blocks of nations. Now, if we look back at one of the secret societies that I'm going to cover off in the book called the Club of Rome, they were created in the late 60s and into the early 1970s. And one of the main, and they are very, very high up in these order of secret societies.
Mm-hmm.
Their main goal is to bring world government, 10 blocks of nation empires. That's their stated goal.
They've got it
And
all
again,
planned out.
they've got it all planned out, and they're going to cattle herd people through all sorts of scare tactics and propaganda, and a constant work through all their other organizations to bring the world together. Ultimately, they're going to need some cataclysms to make this happen, but that's their ultimate goal. And they use things like, they came up with a number of policies in 1972, as I recall, that they were going to utilize to propagandize people into going to world government. And one of those is peak oil. And we're running out of oil, and of course we haven't seen that. Another one was overpopulation. Yes, the population keeps increasing, but technology does allow us to keep feeding people. If we could just learn how to cooperate a little bit more and have less wars, maybe there wouldn't be any starvation. And the other one that is so popular today, and was their creation in the 70s, was global warming. And at that time, if people can recall, and I know I was going to school then, we were taught we were going to be going into another ice age. And so they'll use anything to cattle herd people into the direction that they want to go, including brainwashing the people.
Do you think that right now, them talking about the climate chaos, how they said at first there were 500 days, do you believe that is part of their big plan?
Yes. Yeah, I've heard a lot about the 500 days. It's not clear to me who's going to announce that, how that's going to come about, but it would not surprise me that we're going to hear a lot about that. And for all we know, they're the ones that, with their technology, are actually creating these weather disturbances. One thing that Christians know is some of the signs of the end times are things like hurricanes and volcanoes and earthquakes and all these cataclysmic things, right?
Correct,
So
yeah.
if you're from the other side, think about this. are you going to want to recognize that those things are true from what the Bible says, or do you want to create your own version as to why that's happening?
It's true. That
Absolutely.
That reminds me that I was reading or listening to something the other day, and they had made the comment about this Pope that's in office now, that he fits exactly to what was prophesied, that he would be the last Pope, the name, everything, right down to the last detail. And they're wondering if maybe that was done on purpose, the choice of names, where he came
Yeah.
from, just to
Yeah.
make people believe.
I think you're referring to, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're referring to the prophecies of St. Malachi,
That's correct. I
Catholic
am.
prophecies. Yes. And so if this is indeed the last pope, he'll be the anti-pope, as they would call him in that.
Hmm.
And he is the last pope. This is in numerical values if those prophecies are true and accurate, because they're not canonized. But thinking possibly there might be a reason that they didn't want to canonize these and put them into scripture. But anyways, they're at this point they're a bit more apocryphal, I guess. And I don't rely I guess where I'm going with it, I don't rely on anything totally that's not in the Bible. But let's connect it back to the Bible. And let's say, okay, through coincidence or otherwise, this is the last pope that was prophesied, and he is called the anti-pope. And anti-pope has a couple of meanings, just as we understand the term antichrist. So we kind of understand that as the opposite or the foe of the true Christ. Still a Messiah type figure, but one evil, one very good. Well, anti-pope has that sort of connotation, so he's not going to be a pope for the good, he'll be a pope for the evil and to lead us in another direction. But there's also a second meaning to the word anti-pope, and that is replacement pope.
Oh.
And so what's very, very important, in I can't believe is a coincidence, is that we have two popes right now. Benedict is still alive, and I believe this is the first time that's ever happened, and he has replaced Benedict.
Yes.
And then the other allegory that's used to describe the last pope is that he will be known as the Black Pope. Well, if you're not Catholic, you may not know what's significant about this. Well, the Pope at the Vatican is known as the White Pope, and the society that was created in the 1500s to replace some other organizations that I cover off in my book called the Jesuits, their leader is called the Black Pope. And for the first time, we have a Jesuit Pope that is the Black Pope in the Vatican, who is a true anti-pope. And you have to understand that Malachi prophesied 300 years before the creation of the Jesuits.
Way, way long ago, before he could have possibly lived to see anything.
Yeah, so I think it's very, very important that we watch this Pope to see whether he is, according to Bible prophecy, this doesn't have to be the last Pope, the one that leads and prepares the way for the false prophet and the universal religion. There could be more time yet, but boy, he is a good candidate. There's no doubt about that. So we're really going to have to watch what he does with doctrine, and he is playing around the edges on doctrine in so many cases, and we're going to have to see where he goes with that.
We're definitely living in interesting times.
Exactly.
Well, Gary, I think I want to let everyone know that you are going to be my guest again next week, and we are going to get even deeper into the Genesis 6 conspiracy. Before we close down for the evening, would you please let people know how they can get a hold of you, how they can order your book, everything that they need to know?
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm on Facebook. You just have to look up either Genesis 6 Conspiracy or Gary Wayne on Facebook. So I'm listed as Gary Wayne. I have a couple Genesis 6 Conspiracy pages. I'm also on Twitter and again, just plug in Genesis 6 Conspiracy. You're going to find me. I also have a website, www.genesis6conspiracy.com. And on that website, I have all of the chapters loaded on there with some pictures and a little excerpt about each chapter so people can find out a little bit more about the book. There's also connections on there to buy the book if you buy from myself if you want an autographed copy, or there's connections to Kindle, the Kindle format, and there's connections to Barnes & Noble and Amazon.com. The book is available through pretty much all the online distributors, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and it is also distributed by Send the Light Distribution, so it's available in the United States through all of the Christian bookstores as well.
I encourage everyone to take a look at his website and put an order in for his book. It is just knowledge-packed. This is something that we need to know in this day and age, from what happened then, that's happened through history, to help us to understand what's going on right now. I would like to go ahead and say tonight's closing prayer, if that's okay. Are you ready, Gary?
I am.
All right. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for being with us tonight through this broadcast and letting us have this fellowship time together and with the people that are listening. And the information that's being presented is so important, God, and we know that, and we thank you for bringing Gary and his knowledge on to share with us. And we pray that you bless all of the listeners, Gary, everyone during this week. Keep them safe, Lord. Let your blessings just rain down on them and touch them, Father. And we just can't thank you enough. And I ask you and I thank you in Jesus' holy and mighty name. Amen. Okay, that's it for this week, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Good night, everyone.